Let's face it, sometimes history can get in the way of a good movie. And while we don't fault these films for playing it loose with the facts, sometimes those overlooked details have major historical implications. So, today, we're throwing popcorn at some popular movies with major historical plot holes. But before we right these wrongs, why don't you head right on over to the subscribe button, then head into the comments and let us know what other movie misconceptions you want to hear about. For now, the following is based on a true story. Mostly. In 2000, Universal Pictures released U-571, a fictional film about an American submarine named S-33 that was based on the true story of the capture of U-110. Not since Star Wars have so many plot points been identified only by letters and numbers. Set in 1942, S-33 and its motley crew featuring Matthew McConaughey, Harvey Keitel, and improbably John Bon Jovi embark on a perilous mission to intercept a German U-boat. The goal is to capture the Enigma machine, a device imperative to cracking German codes. An exciting and star-studded romp, to say the least. There's just one small problem. It never happened. A story with all the same ingredients did take place, but it was the British who recovered the Enigma machine, not the Americans. In fact, the British completed the quest in 1941, before the US even entered World War II. Predictably, U-571 was sunk by British critics and commentators, calling it an affront to the brave British sailors who really lost their lives. If you're looking for a 100% historically accurate 13th century account of the First War of Scottish Independence, Braveheart ain't the way to go. The film is rife with historical inaccuracies, missing characters, and costume errors, and we're pretty sure we saw a guy wearing a wristwatch during a big battle scene. One of the most glaring discrepancies is the relationship between Mel Gibson's William Wallace and Sophie Marceau's Isabella of France, the eventual Queen of England. In the film, Isabella is sent by her father-in-law, Edward Longshanks, to negotiate with Wallace, knowing full well she'll be the foil that weakens the Scottish rebel. Isabella ends up siding with Wallace anyway, and the two begin an affair. The film even implies her unborn child, spoiler alert, the future King Edward III, may be the dashing Scotsman's. Yell freedom, roll credits. Great story. Except, during the events of this movie in 1305, Isabella of France would have only been about 13 years old. Didn't marry Edward II until he was already king, and didn't give birth to Edward III until 7 years after Wallace's execution. So it's unlikely that the real story happened the way the movie portrayed it. Zack Snyder's epic 300 shows a highly stylized version of what happens when 300 of King Leonidas' best soldiers go head-to-head against a vast Persian force at Thermopylae in an all-out slobber-knocker match. This battle really happened, but the film may have fancified the story a bit. We know, you're shocked. The most significant change the movie made was to not emphasize the role of the Greek soldiers who fought alongside the Spartans. They get a mention here and there, but Leonidas essentially badmouths them the whole time in favor of his professional army. And yet, history should remind us that the Greeks brought in a good 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers from many different factions. While most of the army split before the final deadly engagement, it should be noted that a group of about 700 Thespians very willingly fought alongside the Spartans to the very end. Also, monsters, hulks, and magicians are not mentioned in any historical record. Release the history cut, you cowards! Indiana Jones spends a good chunk of Raiders of the Lost Ark in Cairo trying to discover the location of the mythical Ark of the Covenant before the Nazis, who seem to run the whole place, intimidating anyone in their path. But in real life, Indy might have had an easier time. Egypt was an independent kingdom in 1936 when the movie takes place. If anyone was occupying Egypt at the time, it was the British, hanging out after decades of colonial rule. But 1936's Anglo-Egyptian Treaty kept their relationship close and formal until the Suez Crisis of 1956. Germany wasn't exactly the most popular country in the mid-1930s, and the British would have been keeping a close eye on any Third Reich soldiers hanging around, especially if they were causing trouble like in the film. Instead of dealing with one low-key espionage plot, a Britain-German confrontation would have likely caused an international incident and tacked another hour onto Raiders at least. While we're picking on Indy, let's take a look at the time he and Elsa Schneider, played by Alison Doody, traveled to Venice to find the Holy Grail in the Last Crusade. At one point, they head underground to explore a series of catacombs before stumbling into the tomb of a knight who found the Grail during the Crusades. After some exciting hijinks, including a fireball and a bunch of rats, Indy exits through a manhole in the middle of a Venetian street. It's an exciting sequence that only works because of all those catacombs Venice has. Except Venice does not have a catacomb system. It only has a few church basements for the storing of deceased loved ones. Aside from that, Venice's underground simply doesn't have the catacomb infrastructure. The Ninja Turtles would have to call their realtor. The thrilling conclusion to The Sound of Music shows the Von Trapp family stealthily leaving Salzburg, Austria, and scaling the Alps to live free in Switzerland. Maybe not as exciting as Avengers Endgame, but still a harrowing journey for the couple and young children. That is, it would be, if it ever happened. The escape scene in the film is both geographically and historically inaccurate, even though the songs are straight fire. For starters, the Swiss border is about 200 miles away from Salzburg, and with the comfortable durability of Crocs still several decades from being founded, it's doubtful the Von Trapps were able to make such a journey on foot. But that long trek would have been wholly unnecessary, since the Von Trapps lived right by a railroad station. Their action-packed escape from the Nazis was, in actuality, just a matter of hopping the next train to Italy. Now that's more exciting than the Avengers. Molto bene! Now, we're not saying it was a stress-free situation, especially since the Austrian border closed the day after they escaped. But the family likely had their feet up in a train cabin rather than on the ground, scaling the Alps. Probably singing the whole time, though. Gladiator is the ultimate revenge movie. General Maximus, played by Russell Crowe, gladiates his way to the top of the fighting world for a chance to defeat evil Emperor Commodus, played by a pre-Joker Joaquin Phoenix. Though to be honest, he's pretty Joker-coded in this one. When a conspiracy of senators, led by Gracchus, offers to help Maximus in his quest, this finally brings about a new order and a new day for Rome. Maximus may be dead, but a hopeful Rome will live on to have a prosperous future. Not so much. In real life, Commodus was strangled to death in a bathtub, and it wasn't a terribly great turn of events for Rome either. After the assassination, a period called the Year of the Five Emperors saw a brutal power struggle, where several men vied for supreme power. 3 decades later, the empire would almost fall apart due to the crisis of the 3rd century and wouldn't be reforged until the reign of Diocletian, though Rome would never retrieve its former glory again. I guess they weren't entertained. Wonder Woman has battled many villains in her time, including a cheetah woman, giant demons, and perhaps most dastardly of all, General Erich Ludendorff, a human man. Ludendorff wants to turn the tide of World War I by using new and deadlier forms of chemical warfare, but he's foiled by Wonder Woman's sword in his chest on her way to fight the god of war, Ares. Well, this superhuman version of Erich Ludendorff is powerful enough to do battle with an Amazonian. The real Erich Ludendorff was a supreme commander of German forces near the end of the First World War. IRL Ludendorff was the mastermind of a huge yet ill-fated offensive in 1918 that hoped to retake the initiative from the Allies. That ultimately did not work out for him. After the war ended, Ludendorff mainly became a mouthpiece for the conspiracy that suggested the armistice only happened due to a German traitor in their ranks. He was not, in fact, stabbed by an Amazonian goddess, although we admit that's a little nitpicky. Ludendorff lent his support to any far-right cause in Germany that would have him, and even hung out with Adolf Hitler in 1923. Yeah, remember that guy? Really, you don't. That's weird. Some even suggested there would be no Third Reich without Ludendorff, making him even more of an evil character than the film would have you believe. So, there were no cameras around in 10,000 BC, and since we can't actually know what was going on back then, it's unlikely anyone went into theaters expecting 100% historical accuracy. But what we got was still pretty silly. The story revolves around hunter-gatherer hero Delay, who has his world turned upside down when slavers kidnap his loved ones. While tracking them across the desert, Delay comes upon an advanced city where gigantic pyramids are under construction. Well, they're not explicitly called the Great Pyramids of Egypt, probably because none of those words would exist for several millennia. It's difficult to imagine what else they would be building. But the thing about the pyramids is we know they're dated as being constructed around 2780 BCE, roughly 7,000 years after the events of the film. Egypt came into existence around 2900 BCE, and doesn't mention any pre-existing pyramids that have been hanging around for thousands of years. In other words, if there were gigantic skyscraping pyramids in 10,000 BC, we probably would have found the remains by now. Good thing Roland Emmerich never made a historically inaccurate film again. Right? A sinister cult of Indian killers known as the Thugs have found themselves the villains in two major Hollywood motion pictures, 1939's Gunga Din and 1984's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The Thugs supposedly operated from the medieval period through the 19th century and were notorious for strangling anyone they could get their hands on. All of these horrific acts were done to appease the bloodlust of the Hindu goddess Kali, making scenes of human sacrifice and yanking a still-beating heart out of a chest commonplace. But what were the Thugs? Did they even exist? And if so, is the narrative about their viciousness warranted? While some argue that the Thugs are a tall tale used to justify British colonialism, many others believe they were real, but were more like a gang that killed for profit, rather than a cult with a twisted devotion to any kind of deity. Still, that heart scene is pretty cool. So what do you think? What are some movies with historical plot holes that you noticed? Drop us a line in the comments to let us know, and while you're there, check out some of these other videos from Our Weird History.